So, oh, it did come up there. Okay, great. We split screen there. What can you expand? Can you expand scope of practice or scope of confidence?
Competency.
Why can't you expand scope of practice? What?
There's legal mandates that dictate what you can do based on your professional role at the time.
Yeah, you have to get more education. So you'd have to get more licensing. You're kind of capped at whatever the scope of practice dictates. Um, what about with standard of care? What do you guys remember from that? So minimum of what we need to do. What else do you guys remember about standard of care? If you remember anything.
Was that when we were talking about like the different frameworks and like theories that we were going over?
It's a little different, but we'll bring up the theories. So standard of care, just to recap, and I'll recap a lot of things throughout, just so that you think about it again. It's legal and ethical because it's guided by statutes, which are legal, and then like the NASW Code of Ethics, which is ethical, and it tells us generally what is the bare minimum for our practice, and it also we need to be meeting that to avoid things like lawsuits. So if we're following the standard of care, we should be pretty good. We're following within the scope of practice. We're following within the scope of competency. We should be pretty safe with that if we get sued. Hopefully you never get sued, but you never know. A lot of people like suing. What do you guys remember about the theories? There's two main theories. Do you remember them?
Absolute and
Relativism.
Yeah. So how would you recap absolutism?
Absolutism isn't as flexible. It's very it adheres very closely to what the legal guidelines are and what our ethical guidelines are, while the relativism is a little, like, if it were kind of like on a scale, they shift more towards like what are our ethical duties versus what's like absolutely legally necessary.
Yeah. So absolutism is looking more at rules. You either follow the rule or you don't. Relativism is looking at what are the consequences of decisions, and then that it plays a part. They both have downsides, so there's not like a preferable one because let's say obviously with absolutism we could violate ethical principles. We might not take into consideration self-determination, that kind of thing, because it's very clear that this is either right or wrong. With relativism, the challenge can be is that you could continue to pull apart everything, and in reality there is guidelines. So if you're like super ethically, if your theoretical orientation is ethical relativism and you take it, you could just keep pulling apart everything, right? Because what exists? You get all philosophical. But in reality, there are clear rules that we do have to comply to. That even if we have a great philosophical argument, it won't stand up to the BDS. Even if it's like amazing and they cry and tell that was great, and they still are like, we're taking your license still. So there's no. So they both have downsides. So and then you change over time, and it changes depending on topic. So there's some things that probably everyone is a little bit more flexible with. Usually it's stuff that doesn't impact us personally. We're like other people suffering, well. But when then it become more absolute. Like, no, this is either right or wrong. You can't do that, or you can. So we fall usually in between, kind of depending on what we're talking about. So we fall in between the two, and it, like I was saying, it usually when people get to really like right or wrong, generally speaking, it tends to be something really core to them because it's values. So when you're working with someone, like say a coworker that's very like absolutes right or wrong, be really skillful around that because sometimes we address things in ways that are not skillful, and then nothing's going to actually change, and we just create more problems with coworkers or clients or whatever. You have to kind of consider that when pick your battles, basically. That's a good thing to consider. So today we're going to go through informed consent. I didn't write it in here, but they're in there. So it's informed consent. I can't think today. Professional boundaries, and some other ones. That's what I'll write on the slide, and some other ones for module 3. So they kind of tie in all of the legal and ethical. They start to bleed a little bit. So this connects a little bit back to last week with standard of care. So the legal requirements related to informed consent. So standard of care is the bare minimum. So the legal requirements to meet the standard of care related to informed consent is the following. So when you're doing like your qualifying, if you use any of these for legal, because informed consent can be ethical and legal. There's a little bit of both in there. If you use any of these are the legal requirements. Does that make sense? That would make it a legal response. So we want to make sure that we discuss limits of confidentiality, the risks to treatment. So it's really important when people come in to let them know that they actually might get worse. And if they're actually doing therapy, they are going to get worse. Like people that do like real legitimate therapy, which most people can't tolerate that. Probably in all the years I've done therapy, handful of people that could actually tolerate like legitimate, like insight-based connecting, because you have to have a certain level of ego strength that most people don't have to be able to like see where you're screwed up, but use it skillfully, not be like, I'm so stupid, this is why I hate myself more. Like to actually say, okay, now what do I do with this kind of thing. So you do want to let them know there's risks to treatment. You might become worse. So when I work with people that had a lot of trauma, as soon as we started opening up the trauma box, they got worse. And that was pretty much expected. They would become less stable. Obviously, I work with people that were more severe, so hospitalizations would increase. Because it's kind of like taking a splinter out. It hurts, right? Like it's probably not a great analogy, but when it comes to people working with their trauma, they either have the dull pain that just goes throughout their life, like a splinter. You know, it doesn't hurt as much. When you try to pull it out, it hurts really bad. And you have to kind of weigh, like, is this worth that? And for some people, it's not. So you do want to let people know they might not get better. They might get worse. It might bring up other stuff that they didn't remember. So, like, if I do EMDR with people, there's a good chance that as soon as I desensitize memories that have been holding their psyche up, new memories will start flooding in. Because now they're desensitized, they're not just surviving, and so their brain is now like, oh, remember this too? And they're like, oh, I don't actually. So you want to let people know that. You want to let them know whatever the risks are to the intervention. So like with EMDR, one of the things that you let people know is that with EMDR, your memories will sometimes actually completely change, because memories are just a chemical reaction within the brain. And so you let someone know, if you have a pending lawsuit, you might not want to do EMDR, because the whole memory might shift and change. And so we don't want it. You want to let them know so that they're informed to make a decision of, I don't want to do that then. I got to get my money, or whatever the thing is, workers' comp. Did you have a question?
Well, for that at least, like you said, they'll get worse, but eventually they will get better, or they will just.
Sometimes.
And sometimes they don't.
It depends on the person. So, I mean, in a perfect world, yeah, everyone will. From my own experience with people, some people, you'll learn it in psychodynamics. It's called the depressive position, so it's related to object relations. And there is a phase where, so to give you a really brief object relation, so it makes sense in context. Melanie Klein, who was someone that came after Freud, so a neo-Freudian, created object relations. So basically, when a child is a baby till about 4, there's stages of how they understand objects. So initially, babies have no idea between themselves and others. They're just like, everything's weird. I'm no longer in this like slimy stuff. And like I poop myself. Like there's all these things. They're not thinking like, well, there's an object out there. They're just like, feed me, bathe me. Like there's no concept of like self and other. And then they go to a phase where they start to realize that there is something external, but they start to objectify it. So that's where what you'll hear, especially if I don't teach it, you'll hear good breasts, bad breasts, and you'll be like so tired of hearing that. But the idea is that then at some point a child then is like, this boob gives me milk, but this one doesn't. So that breast is bad, and this breast is good. So you start to objectify things. It's not that things are people or they're attached to mom. It's like they either serve me or they don't. And then there's a stage where kids realize, yeah, I'm separate from mom, but they don't understand that mom has a whole different experience. They think their experience is universal. So and then the final stage, which intellectually we all go through, emotionally most people never get to this last stage, where they understand that they are separate from others, and that others have completely different experiences, needs, and wants that have nothing to do with them. So intellectually, we all go through it, because all of you guys know that I'm not part of your mind and that kind of thing. Emotionally, most people don't get past 1 or 2 stages. So how many of you guys know someone who everything's about them? Like literally it's not, and somehow it's about them. Because they're stuck emotionally in that stage where they actually can't differentiate. Everything is really about them. Then you go to the stage where you know, I'm sure, or maybe you are that person, where everything's objectified. You either benefit me or you don't. And as soon as you don't benefit me, done. Everything is utility. So they're adults and stuff, but the way that they engage in relationships, everything's utility. Then the third stage is when you do understand that others have experiences, but you haven't realized yet that they're separate from yours. So that might be the person that goes through recovery, becomes an alcohol and drug counselor, and then prescribes their experience of recovery onto everyone. They have good motivations, but their experience of recovery is not universal. But they act like that. You see that with social workers too. They went through something, they're like, this is where you're at. Oh, I don't know. That's where you're at. And then the final stage is when you realize that there's things can be both good and bad, that things are separate and that you're not the center of the universe. So when people get to those stages, they get what's called depressive position. And it's when you come to the realization of reality, which is hard to realize that your parents both messed you up and you messed yourself up and you kept doing it. Like you continued the process. There's not like one person to blame or one way to fix it. So when people get to that stage, which is more advanced, it's tough for those people when they start to realize that this person I love can both be horrible and fine. Because everything's extreme. Like they're either great or they're not. I'm either good or I'm bad. So sometimes people get into depressive positions. Psychologically, it's healthy, but it might not feel very good. Because it feels a lot better when you keep telling yourself, at some point, everything will be fine. I'll find the right person. I'll be the right weight. I'll be the right whatever. That is much more hopeful than reality. That even if you find the right person, they still fart. Even if you get the perfect weight, you're going to gain weight. You know what I mean? So sometimes, depending on the person's psyche, it can be not good for them. Because they have to come to terms with life on life's terms, which is a pretty tough thing, if that makes sense. So that's where it can be harmful. And the same with, like, if you're working with couples, you want to let them know, because every couple I've ever worked with, their relationship has been dead for years. I'm like, I don't do resurrections. I'm not sure what you want me to do with this pile of ash and resentment. There's a lot of that. So you want to let them know you might still get divorced. So you inform them, though, when they come in, because if they don't know that, then they might sue you. Oh, you said you'd fix it. No. No one can fix this. All that right over there. So it's basically informing them, letting them know that they could have other stuff come up that they never dealt with. You see that a lot with EMDR. Once they start processing memories, the floodgates start to open of stuff that their mind has repressed as a defense mechanism, and they're like, "What the heck did I want to deal with this?" They didn't know what was in there, you know. So that's informing them, letting them know there is risk to treatments, and that you might get worse before you get better. Kind of like with medicine, sometimes when people get put on SSRIs, it takes a while for it to actually kick in, but their energy might increase, so they might become more actively suicidal. Because before they were suicidal, but they had no energy. But now the medicine's kind of starting to work, so they have more energy to now fulfill the suicidality. So you just let people know. Kind of like when you see those commercials where everyone's happy, and it's usually for like if you have like bleeding ulcers or like your eye's gonna fall out, and it's like people holding hands, and then at the end it's like, and then you might die, diarrhea, and you're like, oh, okay, ask your doctor. So does that make sense? So you do want to just let people know. You don't need to spend a lot of time. You don't want to make it gloomy, but you do want to let someone know. This might get really hard. And that's normal. And I'll be there. Like a lot of the people that I work with that were borderline, for 6 months, all I would do was feelings. They hated it. But I could tell when they started feeling feelings, they looked like a train hit them. They'd come into session, I'd be like, ooh, those feelings, just right there. They're like, oh my gosh, it's so hard. And I'm like, yeah, and it's going to be. Like, I'll support you, but it's going to be hard. Like, there's not a way around that. But I'll be here for you. So that's what you want to let people know so they can make a decision. I don't want to deal with that. I'd rather just be ignorant. And then you're like, cool. Like there's nothing wrong with that. You'll see that if you work with people a lot, they hit a point where they're like, I'm done. I don't want to understand any more about myself. Like this comes with all kinds of complications that I did not intend. I'm done. And then you're like, okay, great. And they move on with their life. Did you have a question?
Yeah, I was going to ask real quickly, the depressive position, is that like in a theoretical framework, or is that Klein?
It's part of object relations. So Melanie Klein was the initial person, and then from there, like Bion, it's Bion. There was another. They all kind of took it and twisted it a little bit. So depressive position is kind of the place when people start to come to terms with life.
Yeah, is that like the progressive, right?
And it's a higher level. If people can get to that, it's a higher level. But it's also depressive position, which is probably not what people consider to be healthy. You know what I mean? Like sometimes people's minds, what healthy is mentally, is way different than reality. Mm-hmm. Because they're learning from object relations, they're learning that the objects can be both good and bad. And that is hard for most people because either something's good or it's bad. You know what I mean? Like if you're not sure, watch 90 Day Fiancé. They go through extremes. You're either all good or you're all bad. And so when they start to integrate the reality that, maybe there's not going to be a happy ending. This person that I love can also destroy me. They have that power. Whether they will or not is irrelevant, but they do have this power. I have little control, actually. And so that's what they consider like a depressive position. And sometimes when people get to that, it's hard for them to like, it's really healthy and great, but I think we don't really know how to deal with like real happiness. We know how to deal with like this idealized version. And so when they hit that, they're like, what the heck is this? And you might see increases of things. Increases of hospitalizations, wanting to take a break from reality. When the fantasy starts to wear off, and you start to see reality for what it really is, you might see like increases in hospitalization, increases in substance use, because it's really hard to integrate that for most people. So I don't know if that helps.
Is there anything beyond the depressive position, or is that like?
Yeah, there's actually a lot, because it's kind of moving into acceptance, which there's so much freedom in that. but it's a tough, it's a long period of time, and it's continuous. It's not like someone just, nothing's linear with people's psychology. So they might hit a depressed position in a certain context, work through it, keep working, and then hit another one. It's not like you just like go forward. Like sometimes you go back. So when they do it, if I don't teach it, the teacher that teaches it doesn't like plan a lot, so she didn't go a lot into object relations. But if I do, then I'll talk more about, because it's something that people that really do a lot of work, they usually hit, and the goal is to really help them predict it before they even hit it. The depressive position. As you see them moving towards it, you're now helping them predict it, and then how are you going to deal with that? Because you're going to hit a point where you realize that your bubble's popped, and that's going to be a lot of owies. And everyone has one. Yeah, I mean, if you do social work as a therapist, depending on the consumer, our goal is to pop some bubbles. You're like, hey, I'm here and ready to pop some bubbles. And it looks like you've got quite a few, so let's get started. So alternative treatment, so we want to let people know, we can't go deep into them because it's out of our scope of practice, but we want people to know that there are alternatives to therapy. You can go get medication, essential oils, adjusting your diet. There's research on a lot of compulsive disorders and gluten. So you can say, there's other stuff. It's not just this. Chiropractor, church, whatever. If they ask more, you just encourage them to look that up because it's not something that's within your scope. You want to let them know your cancellation policy. So I'm going to get my money if you don't call me within a certain amount. And you want to make sure you do that because people will play that. Part of the therapeutic relationship is having clear boundaries that you respect. There's a lot of stuff you can do with that within a therapeutic relationship. So if you're doing cancellations, I recommend that you get their credit card on paper. So you can say, you don't have to talk to them about it, you just charge them. Need my money. Because it makes a clear message, too, of what is acceptable and not. So there's a lot of therapeutic benefits to that. Communication practices. Will I talk to you between sessions? There's some people that want to talk to you throughout the day. And they're like, hey, best friend. And you're like, yeah, I'm not. Unless you're like best friend about to kill yourself, I'm not going to talk to you right now. So you let them know, will I talk to you? How will I talk to you? If it's a crisis, what will I do? And at what point does this now become a session? And it'll be fun because if you say like 15 minutes, it'll be like 14 minutes, 30 seconds. Off the phone. I can't handle this, but 14 minutes, 30 seconds. Okay, thanks so much. Your background. So you let them know I'm an LCSW, or I'm a student. I'm interning. I'm in a master's program. This is what I specialize in. If you do, this is the education that I've had. And we want to let them know informed consent to specific modalities. So modalities are the way you intervene. So there's like individuals, groups, families, couples. There's different versions of informed consent. If you're working with the group, you got to let everybody know. I will keep this confidential, but everybody else, who knows? So be careful what you share because it might be on Facebook Live. Because I can't control what someone else does. If it's a family, you want to let them know there's no secrets because families love to do that. Can I tell you something on the side? If you want me to repeat it, definitely. Same with couples. So you inform them based on the modality that you're working with. To meet the minimum legal standards, this is the standard of care, we need to let them know fees, our status. We need to post our license. So most social workers are violating that. You need to have that little sign like the people that cut your hair. Get that. Put your little license in there. I would recommend getting a P.O. box or using your work, because if you use your home, then it's on, people can look it up, and that's probably not the best. Or just use maybe like a family member you don't like, so if someone shows up, you're like, whatever. Uh, if we're using technology, telehealth, we let them know the limits of informed consent. And then when we're working with HIPAA, so notice of privacy practices is required for any entity that bills third-party insurance, which falls under HIPAA. So it's NOPP. Usually you give that to them on intake. You get this packet of like 10 papers that they never read that tells you how we use or don't use your information, and they sign saying that they've received the notice of privacy practices. And you'll see that like if you go to the ER, they'll give you an NOPP. In some of the legal cases that has informed consent is this Grant, Cobbs versus Grant. And there was 4 principles that arose from this legal case. Clients do not usually have the same expert knowledge as healthcare providers. So they don't know that. They're like, well, Google MD tells me I'm dying. A client has the right to control their participation in treatment, including their right to choose whether to participate in treatment. So you never force someone. Like, I see that with kids a lot. Like, well, you have to. No, they don't. You just inform them of the negative impacts, you know? Like, if you're working with parents and they're trying to get their kids back, if you don't have to. If you don't, then you can't reunify with your kid. But these are your choices. And even if you do, you might not be able to. We're using informing of risk, even if we're not doing like clinical. We're letting people know this is what you need to do. It doesn't guarantee anything. And if they say no, then you don't force them. I see that a lot with treatment facilities where that's not okay. That's like illegal and unethical. The client needs information about the benefits and risks of treatment to make an effective decision about whether they want to participate or not. When consumers seek services, they have a right to know what procedures will occur, information of services, risks related to services, etc. So maybe like a decade ago, EMDR was still considered experimental, so you had to have a separate informed consent to let them know. Now there's enough evidence base that it's not, but you let them know this is an experimental treatment so that they can have whether they want to use it or not. A client relies on the healthcare provider to give them that information in terms that the client can understand. So if you take DSM with me, we'll talk a lot about making things appropriate for normal people. So like if I ever walk by wherever you work and you ask someone, have you ever been manic? I'm going to like punch you in the throat. Because no one knows what that means. Most clinicians don't even know what that means. So you want to make things in a way that they understand. So an example would be, like one of the kids I'm working with that I'm going to start EMDR, I'm not going to sit there and say, so, we have these memory networks in our brain, and some are adaptive, some are not. And you have trauma, lots of it. That doesn't make any sense to him. So instead, I said, hey, do you ever have those thoughts just pop in your head? And they're not very fun. And he's like, sometimes. Like you're trying to do math, and you're like 2 + 2, and then you remember. And he's like, yeah, like when Daddy hit Mommy. I'm like, yeah. And then you tell your teacher, yeah, I didn't finish the test. I was remembering Daddy hit Mommy. It was a lot of work. And he's like, yeah. So what I can do is this thing where it makes it so it doesn't bug you so much. Where you kind of just see it like a picture on a wall. You're not in it, living it. Oh, okay. Do you want to do that? Yeah. That's informed consent for a kid. I'm not going to go through all this like weird vocabulary and all this stuff that doesn't make sense to them because they need it in a way that makes sense for them. And same with clients. You got to think a lot of people don't have the education. They might have language barriers. Like everything needs to be put in a way that's palatable for an average person. So who can consent? In California, anyone over 12. Different in other places. They do have to have mental capacity. So if someone's like maybe like really severe, like maybe they have like cerebral palsy where it impacts their brain functioning too, because you can just have it physically. where they've decided this person can't consent. Usually they have like conservators, but with minors they don't usually conservators till 18 anyways. So you consider that. Can this person consent? Are they understanding what I'm saying? Are they able to process it? If they are, then anyone over 12 in California can consent. There is going to be specific things, though, depending on your agency. Mm-hmm.
So if the kid is 12 and they consent, but the parent doesn't consent, what do you do?
So then what you do, and we'll talk a little bit more when we talk about going a little more into depth of consent. If you can document why this is important and the parents are not supportive, then the youth can consent. What happens, though, is they are now responsible for any fees the kid is. So you have to let them know. Generally, we don't want to do that, but there are going to be cases where someone comes from a family, lots of stigma towards mental health. They're like, I'm going to kill myself. I really need help. You could document then this family is not supportive. This is a substantial risk. And so we are going to start treatment without parental consent. So you document. Mm-hmm.
So what if they say they want to know what's going on in the session? Are you able
Oh, the parents?
Yeah.
Oh, you let them know in the beginning. You ain't getting anything. Like, you let them know. Like, I usually tell parents. So, like, you probably want me to, like, be, like, your little mole. Yeah, totally. Okay, I'm not. Like, the kid has to consent with what they're willing to release. They don't have to. The parent has no... They can't force anything. And parents think they can. So they come in like, I'm a parent. And you're like, well, I'm licensed. I think I win. So you let them know that there are limitations. The kid has to be willing. And if the kid does say you need to clearly identify what are you okay with me sharing with your parent and document it. And you share nothing outside of that.
So you have to have a separate documentation for the child.
Usually I write a note. Like if I'm going to have something where I touch bases with the parents, I'll say, hey, what are you comfortable with me talking about? So I do family usually on the weekend with some of my kids. So I know a lot about them, but I'll say these are like the 4 things I wanted to bring up. Which one are you comfortable, not comfortable with? Of the ones you're comfortable with, what's the limit? Like, do you want me to go deep or do you want me to just kind of brush it? Like, yeah, sometimes you're sad. Like, how do you want me to do it so that they're consenting for what they're comfortable with? And then if they do want, yeah, so you just specify with the kid. Uh-huh.
It might be incorrect, but we're taking families too, and I remember her specifically saying that parents can legally ask have access to your notes. Is that true? No.
No. The only, like, legally, the kid has to consent. They don't have, like, the only way that we have to give our therapy notes up is if we have a court order. A subpoena isn't necessarily even enough.
Okay.
So we'll talk about when we go into subpoenas. Just because someone has a subpoena, we usually, if we can't reach the client, we just assert privilege on their behalf, saying I'm not going to give that. Once a court order comes from a judge, because that's the thing, sometimes people get confused, a subpoena from a court order. If a judge hasn't signed it, I ain't got nothing on to give you. So it's not correct. They don't have access to whatever they want. If a kid's over 12. If they're under 12, that's different, because the kid can't consent to begin with. But in California, once they're 12, they do have to consent. And you can't, there's limits like for safety issues and stuff like that. But like I had a kid one time, he would sign nothing that I gave him. I couldn't talk to the school about behavior, nothing. He's like, nope, don't want any of it. Would it have helped his treatment? Definitely, but he would not consent. So there's nothing that I can do at that point if they're not willing to consent to release. So what you'll find in practice that sometimes things are not done based on the law and ethics. You know, and they're collection. Oh yeah, you can do that. You can't, unless there's something that's changed recently. You can't. If someone's over 12, they have to consent to release information, and they can specify exactly what they want released. And that's why you want to let parents know, because sometimes they think, well, they're just going to tell me everything, and it's like, well, it's going to depend. You know, if they have a lawsuit and they get a court order, then yeah, maybe they get all the information, but that's a lot of work. They don't just go straight to, and they'll throw that around there. Well, I'll sue you. Okay. Like that, subpoena first, then court order after that. Because it's pretty clear like what you do. So yeah. So mental crises, we don't have to get consent. That's one of the exceptions. So if someone's going to come in and be like, I'm going to kill myself, and this I'm going to do it, and you're like, well, would you consent to treatment? No. Okay. Hands tied. Just go on home. No, we intervene then. We don't need the consent at that point. We want to provide informed consent at the onset of treatment. If we don't, then we're not meeting the standard of care. So that needs to be first session, first meeting, informed consent. I'm an intern, I'm a social worker, this is my experience, this is my confidentiality limits, this is the fees, cancellation policies, can you sign the informed consent? And you want it in writing. It's not required, but I would put it in writing. Mm-hmm.
So like the example you just gave for when you can't intervene without consent, does that also work for homicidal intent?
Mm-hmm. Okay. Yeah, so we'll talk about that when we get more into like Tarasoff and suicidality and homicidality. So like they said, California law does not require you have informed consent in writing. For adults, I would never go off that. I would always have it in writing. Minors, you have to have it by law. But just general standard of care, you're going to have it in writing. In most places that you work at, that's the stuff they fill out before they even see you. Notice privacy practices, outpatient treatment consent, all those different pieces. So informed consent, I already talked about a little bit. Couples and families, we want to make sure they know, no secrets, that all information will be brought to the treatment group. Obviously, if someone's saying, hey, my spouse just beat the crap out of me and they said they're going to kill me when I get home, we're not going to go in and be like, hey, guess, that's not nice. Like, you have to think of context, too, and safety issues. But you do want them to let them know that generally whatever they're going to bring, you're going to say. And what you'll find when you tell people that, they do have a fit when you do it, but they want it shared because that's what they told you. But then it's like your fault. Oh, you're so horrible. Okay, whatever. As long as we get this done and fix this family, fine. I'll be the horrible one. When you run groups, let them know participants can talk outside of treatment. It's not ideal, and you talk to them about the consequences of people not participating, if they know that they'll talk about it or bring it up outside of group. But you do want them to know that. Anything experimental, hypnosis, what else is experimental right now? I think rebirthing is actually illegal now. There's like some experimental things, you just need to let them know it's experimental. And usually with experimental things, you want a separate informed consent specifically to that intervention. If you record sessions, you need informed consent. So I wish they did it with social work because I think it would actually make us so much better. But most like psychologists, when they're finishing their last few years, they record the sessions and then it goes to someone and they critique the person and say, oh, did you notice this? Did you notice that? Did you see that you did this? Which helps you gain a lot of insight to what you're doing verbally and non-verbally. And also the client, they might say, oh, did you notice they did that? And you're like, I didn't. Like, oh, it looks like that's something that triggers them. So you just want to let them know. You don't want hidden nanny cams in your office. When can we treat someone without informed consent? If they don't have mental capacity and it's an emergency or crisis situations. There's variations with youth under 12 if the parent with custody is not present. So another thing with consent, ideally we always want the parents to consent. You really have to show just cause if you're going to let just the 12-year-old consent. You have to really prove like this was a good clinical decision. You also want to think about, so when you have couples that are divorced, you need a custody agreement ideally because you need to figure out who has consent to make this decision. Because sometimes they don't. Sometimes it's 50-50, so in that case, both parents have to consent to treat the kid. So what you'll see a lot is parents just being petty with each other. Oh, I didn't mess him up, you did. I'm not going to consent, can't treat him. If they have 50-50 or 100%, if that parent is not willing, you can't treat them. You have to have consent. So when you work with people, with families, it is highly recommended for you to ask for the custody agreement or arrangement so that you know which one, how it falls. Even over 12. I mean, the 12-year-old could, like, it could be justifiable if, say, you had a kid that's 13, their parents have 50-50, one parent's like, nope, it's her fault that this is happening, I'm not going to do it. You could then justify having just the minor consent. Because you're saying there's clear safety issues. But you have to really document that. It can't just be like, I really think this kid would benefit from self-actualization. Like, it needs to be like, there's issues that if without treatment, this is not going to look well. And these are the reasons, the barriers of why I'm not getting consent from the parents. Ideally, you just get it from the parents and the kid.
In this situation, why were you getting consent from both the parents if the kid, if you got it from the child already?
Well, because you have to, ideally, that's not the go-to. So you're not going to just go to any kid over 12. If you can't through the parents and you can justify it, then you can they can consent, but you have to prove that. Like, you don't want to just have it default like, oh, they're 12. I'll just ask you, because when you're working with kids, you're also working with the family, so you want that collaboration and connection. And so that's not the ideal way to go about it. Technically you can, but then you have to look at your agency as well. And then you also have to look at who's involved. So kids in the foster care system, it doesn't work like that. For medication, the courts have to approve it. So there's a lot of differences depending on the circumstance, so it's not like clear across the board. And then some agencies are not going to be okay with a 12-year-old, even if there's justifiable reasons. So you have to look at your agency specifically.
I think I'm just confusing myself now, but I just want to clarify. So, if the kid's over 12 and both parents consent, but the kid doesn't consent, then can you not do treatment? Or no, because they're still...
Yeah, it would depend, because they might be in a mental state where... It would depend. You'd want to consult and seek supervision. And a lot of it's going to be your engagement. So, like, if a kid's like, no, I don't want to do that, then it would be like, well, tell me why. Like, start to explore that.
It would almost be like you're still doing therapy, but they don't really realize it. Okay, yeah, because I'm just thinking of, like I know I had friends growing up, but, like, their parents had to force them to go to therapy. It's like they were over 12. They really didn't want to be there, but somehow they were being forced
Usually,
to be there.
you can... I've never had someone I can't convince to do it. It's just the way you approach that.
So legally, though, but you can still do it even if...
No, you would... Ultimately, I would want the kid to consent if they're over 12. In California.
Okay.
You don't want to force services on someone that doesn't want it.
Even if they're minor.
If they're... Yeah. I mean, it's different if they're, like, on an involuntary hold. If you're like an inpatient, then you can do whatever. But ethically, I wouldn't be okay with that. And how much benefit are you really going to have? If you're forcing someone to do something, are they going to, like, learn from you? Because you just become like everyone else that forces them and controls them. So therapeutically, you're not going to really be able to do much. And then what you do is you work with the kid to find out why, and let them know. Like, I remember one kid came in just pissed, like probably the maddest kid I'd ever seen with the parent. So we split, the parent and I took the kid, and the kid's like, I don't want to ever see them again. I don't want to do family therapy. I don't want to do all these things. And so I said, okay, well, right now I'm just trying to get you out of this house and away. And so we don't have to do family. There might become a point where I don't know if I can justify continuing treatment if we're not doing family, but we're not there. This is like day one. So are you willing to at least have me help you figure out how you can be happier inside? Not to do with your parents. Okay. And then he consented to everything. So a lot of it's just the skill with the kid. Because usually what they're communicating is control. So another really quick story, and then I'll move on. I was at a CFTM, which is a Children Family Team meeting, and adults just love to do this, and even when they're like social workers, like they can't take off their like punitive parent hat no matter what. So there was a youth that was refusing to do everything. Everything. So we have this meeting, and everyone's like, you have to understand. I'm like, this is going to be so effective. We have 5 adults telling them that you have to. They're not following anything, which would indicate that they're trying to control their life. So you're going to come out at bad cop. This will be so effective. I just can't wait. So they're going through and they're like getting all stuck on like semantics. When you grow up, kids don't care. Their brain actually is not made like that right now. When you grow up, you have to follow. They don't give a shit. Why are you telling them any of that stuff? And so then at some point, I'm like, okay, let me make sure I'm understanding. You want control in your life. Because people are just arguing. Everyone's escalating. Yeah, that's reasonable. Well, I just don't want to do that. And that would make sense because you want control. That's what you've been communicating. I want control. They were getting so stuck in the semantics and the power struggle that they were missing. Once we got that, he did whatever I wanted him to do. But if they would have continued in that way of interacting, he never would have. Never, ever. And these were all people with masters. And they were just pushing the power struggle. And I'm like, okay. And we want to make sure if someone refuses informed consent, we document it and attempt to have them sign it later. So if they're like, no, I don't care, then you document patient refused, I don't care. Then you keep having notes where you follow up. At the end of the note, try to follow up with informed consent, client still said I don't care. But you want to consistently do that. I'm not sure why it says there. So let me actually pull this out because I'm not sure where that came from. Okay. I just need to delete that. There it is. Oh, thank you. You're like, you have to read? Like, what? Okay. Sorry. Okay. Okay, so we have to have informed consent for minors in writing. If they're 12 and over and have capacity, they consent for their own treatment. But it is important the parents should still be involved in treatment even if the youth consents. So we want everyone involved. One thing that you might want to do, and this is more just like to build therapeutic relationship, if you're working with a family and someone's not quite 12 and you're having everybody else sign informed consents or release information, just have the other. It has no legal standing, but at least makes them feel included. If you're like, all the cool kids get to sign the release of information except you, it has no legal standing, but it helps them feel like they're part of the process. If a youth consents for themselves, we would not allow parents access to records. So if they consent for themselves, they don't necessarily have access to records. If the youth and the parents consent, you do want to let them know that there might be limitations. Because just because someone requests records, legally, if you think it's detrimental to their mental health, you can refuse the request to see their actual records. So there's all kinds of little loopholes put in. So there, I'll give you an example. I worked with a consumer who basically would go to the board of supervisors like all the time for everything. Would write letters. I was a vet. Well, they were dishonorably discharged for their drug addiction, but left that part out. Would write these letters where it's like, oh, these social workers are horrible. Well, they weren't getting the full story. So I would have to write in my notes. This was someone that was pretty psychotic too, hearing voices, having command hallucinations, poor insight, because that was one of the pieces. So when they were asked to see their whole record, I thought it was detrimental to the therapeutic relationship and to them. Because all that's going to do is give them a bunch of fuel to their fire. They don't understand what I'm writing and the fact that I have to write it kind of negative because I have to meet medical necessity. And given how aggressive and all that, we decided as a team like that this isn't good for them. It's not an issue like, oh, I don't want you to see it because I don't want you, like, this is, you won't understand it, and all you're going to see is this person's psychotic, this person's this, and then that's going to ruin the therapeutic relationship. So you just have to document and justify it if you don't. So an example would be a 15-year-old girl comes in and says, my parents are not supportive of mental health treatment, but they're reporting dysfunction due to symptoms. They can consent, but they are financially responsible. So they're having significant dysfunction socially, academically. The parents are completely unsupportive. I remember one of my friends said their parents used to say, you just need a cold Pepsi. That was their response when they would be like, so, you know, you might write in there, Pepsi didn't work, been drinking it for a while. So you would, but they're financially responsible, and so you want to let them know that. This isn't the ideal, so you really have to have justification for that, but that is possible. If the parents bring a youth, we want to have them engage and also sign consents as well, and make it clear of kind of the limits too. Like, parents don't need to know everything. So what is it that you need to know? Updates. What is the kid comfortable with? When parents are married or have never been married, you only need one parent to consent. So it's only when they're divorced. If they've never been married, they're still married, you just need one parent, you're fine. If the other one comes around, I didn't want that, sorry, that is just following my legal and ethical mandates.
I got confused. So if a 15-year-old girl where the parents are financially
She's financially responsible.
15-year-old.
Yeah, because she's trying to get mental health services because she's having significant dysfunction, so it's justifiable, but her family is not supportive at all. So then she can consent, but then she's financially responsible. At that point, you want to let her know that. Co-pays, insurance, whatever, you're responsible for that. I mean, good luck trying to get it out of a 15-year-old, but, you know, we'll see. So if they're divorced, it's ideal to get the custody agreement from the parents. If they both have legal custody, they both sign. If only one does, you'll see that sometimes where the parent that has zero ability to consent comes in with the kid, well, we got to get the other parent because they're the one that has 100%. And then a custody agreement indicates, so you just want to understand that, get custody agreements, or just really tell people I only work with parents who've never been married to each other or are still married. If you're divorced, sorry, I can't help your kid. Because it gets real tricky. What about a child who's raised by another person, the parent's not around? So you see that a lot. Mom, dad, no one's seen them since, early 2000s. What do you do then? So what you do is you have the caregiver sign a caregiver authorization affidavit. So the caregiver is signing saying, I am the primary caregiver, there is no other person to consent, yada, yada, yada. And then we're not liable if they're lying. So if auntie comes in, says mom's been gone for their whole life and they need help and blah, 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 and then mom comes in the next day, she's like, I was just working yesterday, I don't want my kid having this, I'm going to sue you. It's like, well, no, I followed the legal and ethical mandates, and so I'm covered. You can sue me, it's just nothing's going to actually happen, but, I do look great in a courtroom, so let's go. Caregiver affidavit, authorization affidavit, and you can get those online. And then if a youth is in foster care, So this is the thing, is it depends on the county. So I'm going to say this, but then also keep in mind you need to know the county. So if a youth's in foster care, in some counties the child's lawyer can give consent. Some counties it's the minute orders from the judge. Some counties it's the supervising social worker. San Bernardino would be this triple SP. So San Bernardino, that's it. If you call Riverside and say, I need the triple SP to sign, they're like, what is a triple SP? And they can actually sign in Riverside for consent for certain things, this actual social worker. So if a kid's in foster care, you just need to understand what county, how does that work, how do they interpret consent, and then follow that guideline. And then document it. In case someone tells you something wrong, you can be like, well, I just went off of what they provided for me. We don't have, like, foster parents can't consent technically. I mean, they can for certain things, but not mental health treatment, like emergency situations, that kind of thing. They might come in, foster parents, with consents, but you have to read it specifically because it's very specific. It's not just like across the board. So telehealth and HIPAA. So HIPAA's federal laws, and it's the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act and the Health Information Technology for Economic and Clinical Health Act. California has 2 state laws that inform telehealth. So some states, this could be incorrect now, but some states don't do telehealth at all. It's relatively new. So California has 2 laws that dictate how we do telehealth. That's where you do it over a monitor. Have you guys Kaiser? So they do that a lot. Like, I'll go to my doctor and it's just a computer. And you can actually do that as a side note. It's pretty profitable if you want to do it on the side. Telehealth. You get paid a lot. So the California law requires clinical social workers to incorporate the following into informed consent. Prior to service delivery, they need to be informed and agreeable with telehealth services. So the whole point of informed consent is, do you actually want to do this? This is what can happen. Are you okay with that? This is where I'll break confidentiality, that kind of thing. You want to make sure that we let them know of risks and limitations of telehealth treatment. There's a lot. You can't see a lot of physical body language. You don't see their energy. You don't know something's off necessarily. Like, they could look happy on the screen and be like slicing their arms underneath, and you don't see that. Provide your license type and number, and then document emergency contacts. So with confidentiality, there's different laws dictating that. So it's the California Welfare and Institutions Code, and then the 42 CFR Part 2, which is related to substance use disorders. That's just a whole nother addition to confidentiality. And then there's HIPAA as well. So when there's a conflict between Welfare and Institutions Code and HIPAA, we always pick the most stringent of the both. So I can't think of which one it is, but let's say like one says, what would be a good example? Let's say the Welfare Institution Code says that in this kind of emergency you need to do such and such, and then HIPAA has an added piece that makes it even more stringent. You would do both. You want the most stringent always when there's competing laws or regulations. And let's see. So this just goes over some of the times when it's not required for authorization. Written authorization is not required. So it's a list for you. So if the county behavioral health director or law enforcement are trying to do a 5150 hold or a 5250 hold, we don't have to have releases. When the patient is in serious danger of violence towards others, the emergency response personnel for exposure to HIV and AIDS. So you can never break confidentiality to let someone know that their partner is HIV positive. And they might come in and say, I'm having unsafe sex with everyone. That is not sufficient to break confidentiality. You can, though, if there's a client and emergency personnel are responding, and then later they find out they're HIV positive, we can then let them know without the client consenting. Hey, you worked in this emergency. This person tested positive for HIV. In response and cooperation with valid search and arrest warrants, during the provision of administering emergency services, that's like 5150, 5250 is not emergency, it's after, to a business associate or for healthcare operations, to the courts to administer justice, to law enforcement to protect a federal or state elected constitutional officer and their families, for a legislative investigation authorized by the Senate or Assembly committees between qualified professionals or multidisciplinary teams involved in child abuse or neglect. So basically what you want to find out is whatever you're working with, what are the limits that are going to happen for you? Because it's probably not likely that there's going to be, a legislative investigation you're going to be part of. So you just know for you, what is it who do you need releases from, who do you not? And if there's limits. So like for some youth, probation officers are okay, but it's mainly, or even adults, but it's only to see if they showed up for services. It's not to go further than that. So you need to clarify so that if you're going further, that you have releases signed. So more with the HIPAA guidelines, basically it's just to provide more effective healthcare delivery. This came out of things like doctors would sell your name and information. So if you had a baby, they'd sell it to like a diaper company, and then all of a sudden you get all this like stuff about diapers. Or people just sharing things that they shouldn't share. Names, specific information. If you're even telling a story in public and you don't mention a name, but it is identifiable, you violated HIPAA. So if it's like specific, you just don't talk about stuff outside of work, basically. So it guides how we deal with data breaches. So if we send things that are confidential to the wrong person or someone hacks, how we exchange, what we can exchange with insurances, things of that nature. And once you fall under HIPAA, so if you're not billing third-party insurance, you technically don't fall under HIPAA. But once you have one person that falls under HIPAA, it's an umbrella for everyone then. So if you have, like, there's youth that I work with that we don't bill third-party insurance, they're technically not HIPAA, but because we have kids that are, everyone falls under HIPAA guidelines. And so we comply with the HIPAA guidelines for everyone. Let's see. 42, I'm not going to go too much into this. This is just a layer of protection for substance use. What they found is people, because of stigma, so there's mental health stigma, there's probably even more substance use stigma. Because substance use is a mental health disorder, but it's not seen that way. Like, people are way more likely to be like, oh, they just have mental health issues. And then when it comes to substance, it's like, well, they just got to get it together. So they added this layer to try to get people to seek services because they weren't. So it's just more stringent. So confidentiality is legal and ethical. The legal part is just our legal mandates. We'll talk a little bit about the ethical part, how that plays out. If a consumer discloses past crimes they've committed, we are required to maintain confidentiality unless it meets the reporting requirements. So if they said, I've murdered 50 people, can't disclose that because they're all dead, so no one's in danger. If they say, I'm gonna murder, then you can. If they said, I raped all these people this weekend, it's not, unless they say, but they were 16, then you can. So you have to keep that in mind because there's things where people are like, oh, I'm gonna report this, and it's like, you can't. Like, you're breaking confidentiality and you're liable at that point. Same with like if they rob banks or whatever, like you can't, like say there's like a mass serial robber or something and you know it's your client because they're telling you, you can't do anything. And you know there's a big reward. You're like, is it worth the risk? I don't know. You can't do that. So the exceptions, these are the only times when we can break confidentiality, is if there's danger to self, danger to other, child abuse, elder abuse, or dependent adult abuse. We are not required to maintain confidentiality if a client commits violence or theft against the social worker. So if they come in and break into your office or attack you, no more confidentiality. You're not going to go into deep things like, they really have mommy issues, been really working on that for quite a while. That's excessive, but you can identify that they are a client with you because they've now violated you. And so you're okay with disclosing. You can't even tell someone that someone's a client. So if someone calls, is my mom a client there? I can't confirm or deny. It's a little trickier when they bring the person to therapy. Are they a client here? I can't confirm. Well, I bring them every day. I don't know. I can't tell you anything. So if the consumer passes away, we still have to maintain confidentiality. And what we do then is we try to get authorization from the representative. So there's someone that is the representative for that person. So even in death, you still have confidentiality. It's not just like open it up. When we're providing services to couples or families, we have to have all consumers over 12 sign releases of information. And like I said, it's best practice to still engage the people that are not, so they don't feel like isolated, like they're not part of it. And if someone's not willing, then we can't do that. Like if it's a collateral contact or something like that, we can't do it without, because in a family setting, everyone's information is possibly releasable. So everyone has to agree. When providing group treatment, we maintain confidentiality, and then we just ethically have responsibility to let everyone know that people can tell your business. That is not ideal, but just so that they're aware, so that they they don't share things that they don't want shared. And depending on the context, really push that because it will happen, so that they don't feel like they were misled or something like that. So we're not going to go a lot into lots of details because we're going to have whole lectures just on abuse. So this is some of the child abuse reporting requirements. We need to contact the hotline and call in a report immediately, and then we provide a written report within 36 hours. So have you guys seen the forms that you fill out? Let me show you, just in case you haven't. So this is for APS. So you just fill out this section. You want to make sure that you only can have the information you can have. So sometimes when you call, the person on the hotline will be like, well, why didn't you find that out? And be like, why didn't you do that? And you're like, because I'm trying to ruin your life. Like, it's obvious. But they act like that, like, what kind of person are you? Like, a horrible one. I'm just trying to do my mandates, that's all. And get their information, too. There's a part where you put the person that you talk to and their number. Because what will happen is you'll talk to them. They have you re-say it multiple times. They have to correct it. You fax it in, and then they're like, we never got anything. And like, really? Because we spent a good hour together on the phone, and we really connected, I thought. But I guess not. So this is for APS, and then there's one as well for CPS. So for CPS, you immediately let them know, and then you fax it in within 36 hours. I would just recommend doing it right away because you're going to forget, and then 36 hours will come. So case name, case number, you would be a mandated reporter. If you do this off of work, so this is an issue that has nothing to do with your professional capacity, you're not a mandated reporter, you don't have to do this. You can still call stuff in, but it can be anonymous. But if it occurs while you're working, you can't like wait till you get off work to then call it anonymously. If it occurs while you're working, then you're a mandated reporter. So you just go through, you give them what you have. Sometimes you don't have much. You don't have names. I get ones where it's like, an uncle molested me. Do you remember their name? No. Do you know how old you were? No. Do you know where you were? No. So then I call in. This person reported an unknown uncle molested them at some age, and then they can go forward with that, because then they can go through and see if they're going to respond or whatever the case is. You always want to report that, because sometimes people tell little bits of different things to different people, and so you think it's insignificant, but that's the last piece they needed to be able to go out and figure out where it is. So never just be like, oh, well, I don't know. Just call it in. You covered yourself. And it's helpful if you have reasonable suspicion to call it in, because you don't know. Maybe when they go out there, they find something else that's even more dangerous than you actually thought. So don't just be like, oh, this isn't. If you have reasonable suspicion, call it in. And when the person comes, I think it's next week, the guest lecturer, you can ask her questions too. Mm-hmm.
If your client lives out of state, do you call their state?
I'm going to have to look at the lecture when we get to it. I think you call where it occurred. But I'm not, I don't take that. I have a lecture where we'll actually go over like what happens when it occurs out of state. So I don't know right now, but we'll talk about it when we go through more in detail. So with child abuse, of course not. So we'll just briefly talk about what's considered. Physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse. Emotional abuse is a gray area, and we'll talk about that. Willful cruelty, neglect, general or medical, unjustified punishment. So there is some criteria, because I'm sure with every kid, every punishment was completely unjustified. So there's criteria. Unlawful corporal punishment. So you can spank your kid, but you can't leave marks. Because people, oh, I have a right. And it's like, you do, but as soon as there's a mark, that's when police get involved. You can't do that. That's unlawful corporal punishment. Well, it's any of those things. So if someone says, the kid says, oh yeah, mom, I get these marks, you got to call that in. Because you don't know if it's ever been reported, you have no idea, you don't want to just assume, oh, well, they're involved in child welfare, you don't know. Because the reason they got detained might have been because mom got arrested, there was no parent. They don't actually know about the abuse. Mm-hmm.
Do we know how they're wanting people or anyone now to kind of navigate like anti-vaxxer cases? Where you have minors that want to get vaccinated but their parents don't consent to that?
I don't know, maybe ask the guest lecturer. Because I'm not sure. I mean, in California, if they're over 12, they can consent for themselves to get the vaccine. But I don't know how that's handled. So that would be a good question to ask them. You could just tell them, hey, wait till you're 12. Hopefully the measles doesn't kill you before then. You can. So for dependent adult abuse and elder adult, so a dependent adult is anyone 18 to 64 that requires someone to help them. So it can be a lot of different people. It can be someone that needs like a caregiver because they physically can't. It can be mental. Elder is 65 and older. So, yeah. So the things that we would report is physical abuse, sexual abuse, abandonment, which is a little different than children. We don't have that one. Isolation, neglect, financial abuse, and abduction. So taking a kid is not CPS reportable in California. If someone calls and says, my spouse abducted my child, that's not a mandated report because you didn't see abduction on the previous slide. If someone says they abducted grandma, that's mandated report. So that's where you want to know, because what will happen is people get really just kind of like everything, but you're breaking confidentiality. And if it's very clear that it doesn't fall under there, if something happened where you'd have to justify that. I mean, you do have to reasonable suspicion, but if abduction is not something that we report for children ever, they're not going to probably be okay with the fact that you broke confidentiality for that. Mm-hmm.
What do you do then if you know that a child...
Have them contact law enforcement.
Have who?
The parent.
Okay.
because it's not, if a parent takes another kid, it's not something that we can report. Uh-huh.
Just so I'm understanding, so pretty much all APS or CPS reports break confidentiality.
Mm-hmm. That's why they're exceptions, because you're acknowledging that you're working with them, which is breaking confidentiality. That's why if someone calls, like a teacher, hey, you can't even say that they're open, or you're breaking confidentiality. Because you'll have that, where it's like, the girlfriend calls, the teacher calls, I'm worried about such and such. You can't even acknowledge that a case is open or not open to that person, because you don't have releases. And so you say, I can neither confirm or deny that this person even exists. And you can say, I'm also ethically relativism, so do they exist? I don't know, and then hang up. So yeah, you don't want to, because acknowledging that is a problem. And so you need something written, like, I don't do this anymore because it's a tricky thing ethically. But for the boys that I worked with, if they had an interest in a religion, we would take them. So some of them over time realized I taught at a Buddhist center, so like I want to learn about Buddhism. So it's kind of tricky because I want to enhance their life, but then it's like, what happens when I get there and someone says, how do you know them? You know, you're breaking confidentiality. And even if they don't ask, there could be an assumption because they know I work with kids, disturbed kids, and that kid's, you know, humping the Buddha statue or something like that, you know? So even in the community, like what you want to talk to people about when they come is, how do you want me to even acknowledge you when you're out, if I see you in public? What do you want me to say? Do you want me to even look at you? Do you want to come up to me? Clarify that, because you will probably run into them, especially if you're in a small town. You're going to run into them. And what should I say? That kind of thing. Or let them lead. Yeah. And the same with people, like, I have a friend that lives up in Arroyo Grande, which is just like by San Luis Obispo. I just know you have to be like pretty wealthy to live there. And so sometimes she'll have spouses. She's never met the spouses. Come up to her at one point, oh my gosh, you've helped my wife so much. Can't acknowledge it. Like, who? What? My name's not Mike. My name's Susan. Or something. So, exceptions, danger to self or other. If they're saying, I'm suicidal, then we assess. And we'll talk about that, what the components are, because you really need to know. Just because somebody cuts them, I see psychiatrists do this. They cut themselves, they hospitalize. That is not a reason that you hospitalize someone. If they're doing it to cope, it's totally different than if they're saying, I want to die. You know, and this is how I'm going to do it. So what we want to do is find out, do you have a plan? Do you have thoughts, a plan, and means? There's some of them are like 3-part, 4-part. The main piece is we want to know, do they have thoughts? Is there a plan? Because I imagine sometimes when you guys get really overwhelmed with like midterms, you're like, man, it'd be better if I was just dead. Doesn't mean you're going to do anything, but you're like, this is so overwhelming. So that doesn't mean like 5150 right now. And then do you have the means? So like if one of my kids said, oh, I'm going to kill myself. And I'm like, okay, how are you going to do that? Well, I'm going to steal an airplane and crash. Okay, well, we're good. Because you can't even figure out how to pick the lock. So we're pretty good, I think. So you look, do they actually have access to that? You know, I'm going to go shoot myself. Do you have access to a gun? Well, no. Okay, so there's not really a lot going on right now. So then you could, what you want to do first is you want to try to contract for safety. That usually is not enough, especially if there's a lot of risk. So just because someone signed a safety contract does not mean, that doesn't necessarily cover you. It takes clinical judgment, consultation, supervision, and knowing the person specifically. But if they're saying, like, let's say someone comes in and says, I am going to take all of my pills and die tonight, and you say, would you be willing to give your medication to your caregiver who's there so that you don't do that because we don't want you to die? Yeah, I would do that. Okay, so then what you could tell them, okay, so they're willing to give up the means, so they don't need an involuntary 5150. Involuntary hospitalization is the last thing that you do. And then you tell the caregiver, if they refuse, then call law enforcement right away, because they're now reneging on our plan. If the person does want to kill themselves, and this is why your relationship's really important. So they're like, Mike, I really want to die. And you're like, yeah, like you've been talking about a lot of things have been happening. Would you be willing to go voluntarily to the hospital? Because I want you to be safe. And if they're like, yeah, then you just take them to the hospital. And you technically only just have to drop them off. I've had people where I was a little worried, so I actually sat until they actually got admitted, because I worked with them long enough that I'm like, oh, I don't know. Like you might be like, oh, this is boring, I'm just going to go home and kill myself, because they can leave when it's voluntary. They don't have to stay. But technically, if someone says, yes, I will go voluntarily, you take them to the hospital, you covered yourself. If they say no, so they have a plan, they have means, they're going to do it, you try to contract no, voluntary, fuck you, and you're like, okay, so we can't have a safe, you can't be safe, so then you would look at 5150, which is involuntary. You have to be trained and certified to do 5150, so it's not like you get your master's and then you're like, 5150 you, and you, and you. And then they get put on a hold for 72 hours. What you'll find, especially with kids, so there's a ton of adult 5150 hospitals, psychiatric inpatients. There's very few children's and adolescents. So in this area, I think it is BMC, and they just cut like half their beds. So they have like 8 beds now or something. BMC, Canyon Ridge, Charter Oaks, and one other. And these are like huge different places. Chino, Loma Linda, Covina, like they're not close. So what happens is kids get 5150, but there are no beds. So they go to ERs. And the ER doctor, they do this all the time, they get there an hour later, they're ready to be picked up. And you're like, really? Because they haven't stopped bleeding from when they cut themselves. Yep, they're fine. So you have to be like, okay, it's their liability, but that's their choice. And then if at the end of the 5150 hold, it's decided that they need longer, then it goes into 5250, which is a 14-day. They don't have to stay 14 days. If they're stable before then they can leave before then. Usually with 5150 holds, you keep them for the 3 days, because it takes a while just to get them stable. You know, that's what. Have you guys heard booty juice yet from people? That's the cocktail they shoot in their butt when they're acting out. It's I think it's an antipsychotic and a bunch of Benadryl, but not Shalich. And I think an SSRI. So when people are really like out of control, they get booty juice. Sometimes I'm like, can I get some for home? Like there's tough days where you just can't stop thinking. So other exceptions. These are exceptions of confidentiality. Probation officers are able to get therapy attendance information, not content. So if you're going into, if they're asking like, have they been working on blah, 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 you can't do that. You have to get a release. Disclosing to parents of minor consumers. So you can disclose certain things. Billing third-party insurance. So when someone signs a notice of privacy practices, they're saying they understand that you're going to bill third-party insurance, share their information. That's why they sign that. The client is gravely disabled, so they're unable to meet their needs. The following instances, there is no client right to confidentiality. If a coroner is requesting information during an investigation of the specific purpose of identifying next of kin, or if their death involves public health concerns. So your client died, they had some new version of SARS. At that point, if it's a public health concern, then confidentiality doesn't exist. It doesn't. So if it's a coroner trying to get next of kin, or a public health concern, then it doesn't apply. A court order signed by a judge. So once you get a court order saying give me your records, you have to. So if you just get a subpoena from a lawyer, you can if you try to get a hold of the person and say, hey, do you want me to release this information? Sometimes they're like, yeah, totally. If you can't reach them, then you just assert privilege on the client's behalf. And then they have to go get court orders, and once you get court orders, you're done. You can't fight it anymore. A search warrant naming the therapist as the subject. An order from BBS. So if Board of Behavioral Sciences is investigating you, they have access to your records. They don't have to get the person to agree because they're trying to see if you were negligent or not. So why don't we take a 10-minute break, and then so we'll be back at like 4:45-ish, and then we'll finish up with HIPAA and some other pieces.